So, hello, welcome. I'm Rob Doubleday from the Centre for Science and Policy, and this is the second episode in our series on climate change resilience. I'm joined by my friend and colleague Emily So, Professor of Architectural Engineering, who's leading these series of questions over 4 episodes about climate change, resilience, adaptation, and really what progress has been made at and since the COP26 meeting in Glasgow at the end of last year.
Thanks, Rob. Pleasure to be here presenting the series, which is brought to you in partnership with the research project Expertise Under Pressure, part of the Centre for the Humanities and Social Change at the University of Cambridge.
In this episode, we're really pleased to be joined by Andrew Coburn and Rowan Douglas to talk about financing of climate change resilience and the broader picture of what Glasgow meeting means for the kinds of discussions that are needed to make progress. Andrew Coburn is the Chief Scientist at the Centre for Risk Studies at the University of Cambridge and also Chief Executive of Risilience. And Rowan Douglas, who's joining us, is Head of the Climate Resilience Hub at the consulting firm Willis Towers Watson. Emily.
Thank you, Rob. Maybe we can kick off with the first question really regarding COP and getting your reflections on COP26. How does it differ from previous conferences, and what are your views on how it's progressed the resilience agenda? I'll start with you, Rowan.
Well, thanks so much, Emily, and it's great to be on this series. I was lucky enough to be up at Glasgow for the full 2 weeks, involved in quite a bit of the preparation. And I know that Glasgow got slightly mixed reports, but certainly when it came to both the resilience side and the engagement of the private sector, finance and other sort of non-state actors, I think most of us who were there thought it was really quite a breakthrough, actually. I think for 3 reasons related to this subject, beyond the wider sort of net zero agenda. First is, I think I've been to COPs since, 2014. And this was, without doubt, the first COP where resilience and adaptation wasn't just tolerated, it was actively seen as a key part of the agenda and not something that was being focused on at the detriment of the net zero agenda. And that's taken a while to develop, I would say, in the main zeitgeist of the sort of conference. And that was really very exciting. I suppose the second general observation, and maybe very appropriate in the home of Adam Smith, or at least where he was professor in Glasgow, in that this was, I think Glasgow will be seen as where the economics and finance of climate became mainstream, where Paris was really about politics and governments. And there was no doubt, partly through the work of Mark Carney and many others, including financial regulators who've been focusing on this for the last 3 or 4 years, absolutely clear that climate risk, broadly defined, is now a key focus for integration into the mainstream financial system, and that really the invisible hand of economics needs to be, Adam Smith's invisible hand needs to be retrained to be sort of updated. And just the presence of, despite the challenges of getting to Glasgow, what was really notable was the extent of business and finance, as well as public finance, being there, very strongly. So, and since then, in London, there's been probably one of the main sort of follow-on conferences from it, the Net Zero Finance Summit at the City of London. We had Mark Carney back over, I think John Morton, the US Treasury Czar, and quite a cast really to drive forward the agenda. So I would say many of us are really quite encouraged by what happened in Glasgow. Much to do, but certainly I think an inflection point in certainly the resilience and adaptation and related finance side.
That's great to hear. And Andrew, would you agree with that assessment of COP26?
Yes, I think I was privileged to be there for the first time this time around, and I certainly agree that the impact of economics was certainly front and center, exactly as Rowan said. I was slightly disappointed, I think, in the representation of businesses around the table. It was certainly well outnumbered by the number of NGOs and policy makers, and I think a lot of the action that's needed, it needs to involve corporates and large companies. There's still that sort of tension between the policymakers sort of telling them what to do and their own sort of self-interest. And I think that's a theme that we should sort of pick at a little bit on today's sort of call, really, is sort of the tension between the policymakers. But it was very encouraging. I thought there was a huge positivism. My main observation is that it's still very piecemeal. Each of the arrangements, like the Methane Act or the Agricultural Agreement, is a sort of voluntary gathering of each of the different. Each country has an option into which of the treaties it signs up to, and as a result, we've got very sort of patchwork set of lots of different agreements going on in different spheres. And of course, I think the hope when we were going through all the COP series was that would there be a much more unified approach. So I think the countries that are really buying into it are going faster and faster, and the countries that are sort of dragging their feet are slowing down. So I think we're getting a very sort of more polarized world, I think, and that makes it more complicated for people to sort of navigate. If you're a global sort of multinational, you've got to negotiate a lot of different jurisdictions running at different sort of speeds, and that makes life complicated. And of course, there's always been this sort of thing: will the transition be orderly or disorderly? And I think it's looking a bit more on the disorderly end of the spectrum. But no, I thought it's really good impetus, and obviously setting up. We're now going to move sort of annual COPs. I think that's extremely encouraging.
Thank you, Andrew. One thing I've picked up when you were describing the experience is the integration side, that the resilience is now fully integrated as part of the business strategy and things that are to think about in the future, not something that's just tagged on. Can you tell us a bit more about how, in particular, the insurance industry has taken this on board? And really the key question is, how has that changed in the last year or so in terms of their strategy and the way they think about resilience?
Yeah, unfortunately, Emily, I wouldn't say resilience and adaptation is fully integrated yet, but it's certainly the door was open in a way that perhaps it hadn't been before. And, even in some of the, main campaign around, obviously, the race to net zero led by the climate champions, but we have in parallel the race to resilience. And so certainly I would just say that resilience and adaptation was no longer the forgotten or slightly less welcome side of the family, so to speak. So, which was very positive. And certainly the insurance sector were there in some force. In fact, through various initiatives that the industry has developed, often in partnership with the UN and other international institutions, groups like the Insurance Development Forum, UNEP-related groups, ClimateWise, based at the University of Cambridge, of course. There's been quite a bit of collaboration over the years, actually, and in a number of areas. So the first, I would say there's probably 2 or 3 main groups. The first is around actually understanding risk, climate risk, physical risk, and its related modelling. And as you know, Emily, this is quite challenging, and obviously Andrew's a great expert too. But when we talk about net zero, it's really quite straightforward, at least in terms of metrics. It's tons of carbon, and we've had that metric, since 1992 or before that, when COP started. And a ton of carbon released here in Britain, where we're speaking from today, is the same as a ton of carbon released anywhere else. And you have a kind of a currency for developing understanding and targets. As many realize, actually, resilience is rather more complicated. To actually measure resilience, often it's the combination for those of us in the sector of sort of engineering, metrics, actuarial science, and human and physical geography. But of course, resilience matters very much where it is and against what type of hazard and key thresholds. And I think for the wider community, that's been really difficult. It's quite difficult to say what is the annual average physical climate risk that different countries or regions or cities face now and into the future. So what's been quite exciting is, I think, a recognition that broadly defined insurance-related thinking around physical climate risks and natural hazards, which has been developed with your help, Emily, and Andrew's and many others at the university over the last 30 years, is probably going to be, if you like, the bedrock of how the wider financial system and indeed wider business and public sectors understand climate risk, also, of course, with a forward gear. And there was a number of exciting initiatives announced in Glasgow. One, the Global Resilience Index, with a set of partners. I think could provide that sort of key reference point. So certainly an exciting agenda on risk modeling. Without that, it's arm waving. What gets measured gets managed. I suppose the other area is a recognition that risk sharing through insurance is not just a private sector product. Actually, insurance, broadly defined, is an institution, and if we can share risks sustainably at local and global scales, it does provide that key governance mechanism that's allowed us to confront other big risks in the past, whether it was urban fire and conflagration in the 19th century, whether it was the big social upheavals we had in the sort of 1930s and 1950s, led to development of social insurance and the welfare state. And I think there's a growing recognition that risk sharing in sustainable risk pools across public and private sectors will be an absolutely essential part of both a resilient future for communities, but also a just transition. And then the final observation, and obviously a big challenge, the loss and damage debate, which has been obviously developing over many years, and often stumbles on the issue of, well, how will the global north, to some degree, compensate the global south for emissions? And obviously that leads to all sorts of challenges. And I think there's a growing sentiment that actually, if we could find a way of sharing the risk through insurance mechanisms between countries, obviously those who have the greater ability to contribute will probably pay relatively more. But that could be a wonderful mechanism, and the G7 summits coming up, I think, are going to focus on this with the help of the German government, could actually allow us to get to a place where the world supports each other, including the poorest and most vulnerable, in the right way, but without having to confront, how can I put it, difficult issues of history and legacy. So very exciting how the philosophy is changing about the role of finance as a sort of a steward of this just resilient transition. So but those are some of my takeaways from Glasgow, and a lot of emphasis, and you'll see from the Marrakesh partnership sort of documents, to actually move from podium to action between now and Sharm el-Sheikh. So we're exactly halfway there, aren't we now? It's 6 months to go. So action stations.
Going back to what you were saying about risk modeling and the challenges of finding the right metrics, even to see what things have changed in the resilience side, even when you have made progress, how do you measure? How do you actually applaud the people and the countries that have done well without it being impounded by some kind of natural hazard disaster, to really be able to judge that improvement? And I guess this leads me nicely to you, Andrew, about modeling and the appetite for looking at different strategies and businesses for adaptation of their assets and their way of business is run.
Yes, very much so. My main experience over the past couple of years working through as a company Resilience, working with large corporates, has been that we're working with large organizations that are major consumers of energy to produce the products and services for their customers. And they're obviously working within this landscape, and they're large companies like Nestle and Reckitt, who produce a lot of consumer goods, organizations like Maersk, who have major sort of shipping operations. And obviously these are big drivers of the overall economy that we're talking about in this overall context. And I think they are all grappling with the new landscape. So, and in this new landscape, the costs of fossil fuels particularly is rising, and consumers are sort of voting with their wallets. So, and these companies are reacting to those external forces. They're studying how is the climate going to change, how might their patterns of raw materials change significantly, and they themselves are adapting and sort of optimizing their businesses for this new reality. So there is quite a lot of sort of trying to make sense of this, trying to forecast out, trying to understand what the regulators are trying to achieve, and kind of working with them. And I think their own self-interests can be relied upon to manage a new economy. I call this ethical capitalism. It's got a new sort of, it's not just the dollars, it's actually how do you become stewards of the environment as well as an important part of running your business. And this requires a lot of sort of data and analysis and forward thinking. And I think what is happening is there's a change all the way down the sort of financing food chain from the companies themselves and looking for their investors. And they get a lot, most of their investment comes from institutional investors, and they have, tax incentives and various other things to play with that. But mainly the investors themselves are looking to get returns from their green investment. They're looking for, will the growth opportunities be for the future? I think that's driving a lot of the actual response, what I would call the adaptation for individual businesses. They're putting some quite serious kind of budgets behind this transformation process that, some of the big innovating companies. So they're literally spending billions of dollars of their own resources on changing the nature of their supply chains, managing the different structure of their businesses, investing in lower emission operations and sort of lower, things that consume less energy, but also greener energy. And those things don't come cheaply. You have to buy new technology and, reorient your business. And that requires a lot of kind of effort. So there is quite a lot of change going on at the moment around how do you finance this? Because you're basically borrowing from the future in order to finance today's change. And that's quite a sort of complex equation. What is the return on investment in their calculus to make that happen? And where all those flows of capital are coming from, the insurance industry being a very important part of that, is exactly the dialogue that's currently kind of going on. There is a new, I'm going to call it the low carbon economy, becoming a little clearer in vision. And the winners in that new economy will be the people who've really planned and thought and invested about how to transform their business for that new reality, I think.
I guess a question for both of you. Where is the innovation in this? Is it to provide solutions? As Rowan said, the focus now really is on action. It's not, we're aware of this now. We're aware of the need for building in resilience. We're aware of needing to get to net zero. But how do we get to the solutions? Where is the innovation in the industry, do you think? And maybe I can go back to you, Rowan, first, and then Andrew.
Well, yes, I'm going to perhaps bring up something that may sound a bit negative in terms of where the innovation lies, but it's certainly where I think the impact is going to be. And Andrew was quite right to sort of point to some of the investment opportunities in the green and by extension sort of resilient economy. I was always struck by the fact that when I entered the reinsurance industry 30 years ago, it's terrible when you can say that about your career. 30 years ago, 1992, entered Lloyd's of London, the same month that Hurricane Andrew struck the east coast of the US. And it was it was the final punctuation mark on that terrible set of losses. The industry was in complete disarray globally. And over the next 20 years, with the help of actually analytics and smart investment in backers of companies as well as regulation, it moved from relative ruin to relative resilience by essentially stress testing insurance systems, not for what had happened, but what could happen now. And you were at the heart of that. And I must say, the word sustainable, the word green, the words CSR was never mentioned. It was simply about properly accounting for risk. And once risk of, if you like, uncertain extremes was properly accounted for, the additional costs of, frankly, additional aspects of safety or the additional capital required was properly reflected in the economic returns. And so the real innovation we need is to make sure that, certainly in the context of this conversation, that physical climate risks and related natural hazards now, because those risks are there now and many people haven't experienced what could happen now, but also obviously how those will progress into the future. That is going to be the innovation. And once that happens, the new requirements that we're seeing now around financial regulation and financial stability, as well as legal duties of care. So an insurance company now has to show resilience, at extreme levels, unlike they ever had before. They're like engineers. And now they're having to show that they'll have that resilience, not just this year and next year, but actually in 20 years' time and 30 years' time. But actually, should not a mayor of a city or a utility provider also have legal duties to be resilient to foreseeable natural hazards and climate change, which can now be modeled to, frankly, much more confidence than most other risks that we face in business and public policy. So for me, the revolution is actually one of thought and ideation. And once these techniques, which aren't rocket science, and they exist, they just need to be propagated more widely. Once we have that transformation, that actually we can incorporate this within our core legal and financial and wider policy landscape, then actually that will provide the motor and the incentive for capital to flow in the right direction, but also to stimulate exactly the sort of innovation and smart new industries and thinking that Andrew was speaking about. But my fear is, until we flick that switch, and I've seen how powerful it can be more widely, I think we'll lack the fundamental fuel to get where we need to as fast as we need to. And that's why this podcast at the center of science and policy is so key, because ultimately it is about policy and science and governance coming together.
Yeah. I guess can we use the private sector, Andrew, to try and stimulate some of these conversations and get the people who invest in resilience and strategize about this to show us the way to do this and build it into the regulations?
Well, yeah. I mean, I totally agree with Rowan's this concept really of the power of frameworks, the thoughts and the ideation, as you mentioned, that you need that overall, thinking to create the incentives for the capital flows and that innovation. And that's exactly right. There's a lot of innovation kind of going on at the moment. There's all sorts of incentives being flown through, and there's a lot of technology development going on in sort of renewable power. There's batteries and storage technologies that are needed. There's a whole sort of array of then how do you push that around the world in new types of grids and trying to create new ships and aircraft that can operate. That world is kind of going on, but ultimately it's driven by, again, incentives and what the innovators and the people who are funding those think is going to be the ultimate return, and what does that new kind of economy look like. And I think some of the quite interesting innovations that I'm seeing are much more around process and around how you manage a business process to realign incentives. And that may sound somewhat trivial, but if you realign a management incentive within a business to incentivize on carbon emission reduction as well as profitability, and square that circle, you change the behavior of the business and it reorientates towards those new incentives. So there are things called shadow carbon pricing that are now being used in businesses to help structure these things. There are a lot of things going on around restructuring product portfolios at businesses and services, and how different sort of, again, I've mentioned the supply chains, raw materials. How do you change the nature of farming to provide much more sort of sustainable outputs that can withstand the changing weather patterns that that we already know is kind of coming through from the modeling. So I think it's a pretty exciting time to witness that innovation that is being come ultimately, again, we're talking about financing. That is how innovation occurs, is the financial incentives. And I'm a great optimist. I think human ingenuity is fantastic and will rise to this challenge, as it has done to most of the other sort of challenges we've seen in the past several decades and centuries, in fact. So I think climate change can be addressed and managed through with human ingenuity. Great optimist.
Can I just ask you perhaps to give us an example of how the work that you've done through the Judge Business School and Resilience has helped corporations think about their futures? And, Rowan mentioned modeling and the importance of modeling and how to help people, guide people through the different parameters that they need to think about. Can you give us an example of this in your work and how that's been able to guide your clients?
Great. Yes. Well, without sort of naming names of businesses, they're typically trying to look at the next sort of 5, 10, 30-year horizons and try and sort of model out, if you like, what the impacts of physical risks, the changing climate and its extreme weather, and the transition risks of how those changing financial structures and tax incentives and regulatory burdens are going to impact their business. So you sort of try and figure that out. The way we work with them is we create a sort of platform and model out their business and then look at how different scenarios of how the climate and transition risks are going to play out. And though that tells them then how that impacts their business, the increased costs from carbon tax they're going to see, or reduced revenues from different loss of market share from consumer behavior, increased cost of capital from various things and things they might find. So that gives them a diagnostic tool to then develop a net zero plan, which is then the investments that you put into lower emission operations, changing the technology in your factories or the vehicles you use for your transportation systems, restructuring your supply chain, perhaps mergers and acquisitions of new parts of your business, and realigning management incentives to achieve a plan that's going to take 20 years, 30 years for a business to really transform itself to get to net zero. These things are not easy to do. It is a major change. And ultimately, we're seeing companies investing, 3, 4, 5% of their annual earnings in this business. And that's a major piece. And as we sort of said right at the outset, somebody's got to finance that. They can finance it from some of their own earnings, but they're going to go out to markets for that. And I think that's a virtuous circle. And it's coming us back to the conversation we began with, which is how do you finance this overall business transformation for the new low carbon economy?
That's really interesting. You bring, nicely to the next question for Rowan about timescales. In my own work, and especially focused on earthquakes, there is this almost luxury of time between big events, and the return periods are such that you can engage with the community and hope that there is appetite. But at the same time, having too much time means that you don't get the attention of the politicians. So I wonder, from your experience, but what you're seeing now in the industry, Rowan, what kind of sort of timescales are we talking about? Are we already too late? Is the insurance industry and the finance industry catching up almost? And are we seeing progress made at the right speed? And how much can we rely on having this time to act?
Well, we don't have much time. I'm very pleased that this whole challenge has been reframed as an emergency, and that we have this critical climate decade of the 2020s to turn things around. Certainly on the resilience and adaptation side, there has been a sea change in perception in the last 2 or 3 years. I think, frankly, because some very rich, fashionable parts of the world in the developed north, whether it be Australia, California, obviously continental Europe, UK and Europe, have been struck by a range of extreme events. And I think that has woken up sort of mainstream business and policy that this is a here and now danger that affects us all, whether you're in a small island developing state, perhaps with a developing economy, or some of the most perceived to be sophisticated and advanced regions of the world. So, that has created a sea change. There was one sort of important sort of public-private coalition that's actually was a flagship at COP. It's called the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. It was just come back from a major program in Jamaica, which has enabled the Jamaican government to understand its current and future climate and related risks to its community infrastructure assets, networks, basically to answer the question, if we have $1 billion to invest over the next 10 years, where best to invest that money for maximum social, economic, and indeed cultural resilience? Because that's what everybody needs to know, and that's sort of happening now. And then that sort of requirement is going to be rolled out very quickly, whether it's national adaptation plans, whether it's government planning and policy, and frankly, whether it's investment. But the other side of it is you've got to go from the macro, which is necessary, to the micro. So at the same time, at an asset level, the same coalition is working through how do you get the DNA of climate risk modeling into the DNA of in real asset and infrastructure cash flows. Andrew and I have seen how you do that in the insurance world, and catastrophe modeling, literally changed the DNA of the industry. We need to change the DNA of many other sectors to sort of marry macro objectives to make sure that that makes sense on an investment by investment basis. But I'm encouraged, Emily, by a recent uptick in sort of progress at the innovation side, and I do think the fundamental techniques will be understood as necessary over the next 3, 4, 5 years. What I'm more concerned about is how quickly these techniques are adopted and mainstreamed across the economy as a whole, because this isn't really about moving 100 billion a year, 200 billion a year of green or resilient finance. Actually, what we've got to do is create the rules that all finance structurally has to embrace these mechanisms. And I think that's feasible, but we're not quite too late, but it is an emergency.
Andrew, how do your people you work with look at the time scales and ways and what they need to do within these time scales?
I think this is probably one of the biggest sort of disconnects because businesses tend to be focused on quarterly earnings, right? So they're worried about the next 3 months. They're not, and they have, if you're lucky, it's an annual target or a 3-year plan. And frankly, our scientific discourse around the year 2100 is not very helpful in that sort of context. But it is a crisis. Things are changing very rapidly today. And that is really what businesses tend to pay attention to. They do pay a lot of time on their 20 to 30 year capital investment program. So they think about that. That's the sort of payback time of a major investment in a new factory or some major infrastructure. So definitely thinking around that. But they're highly motivated by the current change in the opinions, to be honest, of people and customers. And that is changing really as a result of extreme weather patterns. There was a really interesting piece in The Economist a couple of weeks ago about how experience of extreme weather is actually changing the electorate's voting patterns to favor that. And that I think is really interesting, where human behavior is now saying, no, we're going to tackle this. We're prepared to vote with our own wallets about how we think this should happen and make sure that our political representatives are reflecting this in their agenda. So I think that is a hugely important process. And I'm very encouraged that we're all, we're talking about it in such a practical way today about the things that are happening this year. And we're talking about, the next COP coming up and so on. I think it's really, we're thinking about it on a much shorter timeline now than has historically been the case. And I think that's how we should continue to press.
We're getting to the end of the episode now. I wonder if you could both of you have a think about how, a big question for me, how do we keep this momentum and motivation going? I mean, it's great that COP's happening every year and we have a reminder of this every year, but how do you make sure that we don't lose this momentum, all these great things that you've talked about that has been built in the last year or so?
I'll kick off if you like. I think there's a lot of potential distractions that can occur in the short term. There's a lot of things going on. We've got an inflationary spike, and we've got potential for economic sort of short-termism that could be really energy security issues that might be sort of apparently trumping the need for our climate change initiatives. But I think taking that medium-term view of that there will be jump spikes in the economy, but we need to take that view of how is the overall transformation likely to occur and keep that very much on as the primary target of our conversations. I think people, as I say, I have great faith in ethical capitalism as a driving force. And I think people are, providing they see enough information and are looking at the future in a structured way, I think we'll see behavior that really does transform very dramatically over the next several years.
No, I think Andrew's right to sort of highlight the potential distractions, but I think I'm quite encouraged that there's now a kind of critical mass of resources and expertise coming together, aligned with changes in financial regulation or other policy requirements that seem to, frankly, have been pressed forward consistently now globally for the last 3 or 4 years and show no sign of really abating. So I think I'm fundamentally encouraged by that. And regretfully, I think that over the coming months and years, if we do begin to forget, I have a nasty feeling that Mother Nature or Anthro Nature will not let us forget. And I have regretfully no doubt that there will be significant punctuation marks that will remind us around the world in the coming year and through the decade, which will mean that increasingly, as Andrew hinted at, this becomes a higher and higher political issue. So yes, I think we're all committed to be on this case, whether we want to or perhaps whether we don't.
Well, thank you to Andrew Coburn, the CEO of Risilience, and to Rowan Douglas, head of the Climate and Resilience Hub at Willis Towers Watson, for being part of this conversation today. It's been fascinating. I've certainly learned a lot, and it's great to be able to make the connections between what we have been doing, as you say, Rowan, for many years now, to really trying to use that knowledge to inform the future and trying to really tackle the risk in terms of resilience. So thank you both very much for being with us today.
Thanks so much, Emily. Great to be with you and Rob and Andrew. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Totally endorse that. Been a really interesting time. Thank you for your time.
This series on science policy and climate resilience is brought to you in partnership with the research project Expertise Under Pressure, part of the Centre for the Humanities and Social Change at the University of Cambridge.
To hear more conversations like this, make sure you follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn.
As always, if you have any feedback or ideas you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please email inquiries at csap.cam.ac.uk.
Thanks to our producer, Jessica Foster, and researcher, Nick Kostick. And thank you to you for listening.